Hello, I'm Tone Lanzillo, and this is Climate-Duluth. Our guest today is Gaia Vince. Gaia is a freelance British environmental journalist, broadcaster, and author. She has written for the BBC, The Guardian, The New Scientist, Science, and the Australian Geographic. Gaia has also held editorial positions at various science journals, including Nature, Nature Climate Change, and the New Scientist magazine. I first became aware of Gaia when I picked up her book, Nomad Century, How Climate Migration Will Reshape Our World, while I was in St. Paul, Minnesota about 6 months ago. And I have to say, this may be one of the most important books that I've read in the past few years. And I think it's especially relevant for those of us who live in Duluth, northern Minnesota, and in the Great Lakes region of the US and Canada. Gaia, I want to welcome you to Climate-Duluth. Great to have you here today.
Such a pleasure. Thanks, Tone.
Why don't we just begin with your book, The Nomad Century, and what inspired you to write this book?
Well, I mean, I've been traveling around the world reporting on environmental degradation, on the climate crisis, on how different people are affected, how they're adapting, and what responses they're coming up with. And while I was doing that, I actually took a journey of 2.5 years, mainly around the global south, through the whole of Asia and Africa and Australia and the Americas, you know, from Patagonia all the way up to Canada. And during this journey, I realized that a lot of people were already being displaced by climate change, by extreme conditions, and by these kind of knock-on effects of drought or of continual flooding, the economic effects, and how they were, impacting industries and so on. But no one was talking about this. And this was an absolute building crisis. And at the same time, there's been this rising rhetoric, this development of a very strong anti-migrant narrative, which is not just, I mean, it was produced originally by the far right, but it's now bled over to centrist parties as well. And I just, I saw this kind of cataclysmic situation, this nexus of climate migration, the unmet need of environmental degradation and of people, human mobility, and all of these things coming together, and nobody being honest about any of this and nobody talking about it. And so I sort of wrote the book out of frustration, really. It was to say, we need to start talking about this. It's real. We need to start planning for it because it doesn't have to be a disaster.
Right. Wow. In writing the book, any surprises while you were writing the book? Things you discovered while writing this book?
I suppose, I was surprised by the extent to which climate migration is already an issue. There's huge displacement occurring already, most of it within borders, but some of it already crossing borders and increasingly across continents. And also, I guess I was surprised discovering how very recent this idea of border control is. It's only a few decades old. Borders originally were created to keep citizens in, and there were great efforts made to grab citizens from elsewhere, foreigners, and add them to your economy, whether to fight in the military or work in agriculture or industry. It was, the idea that the more people you had, the stronger your nation, the more innovative, the more entrepreneurial, the higher the economic productivity. This was completely understood and appreciated for all time. It's only very recently that we've started using borders to keep people out, and the idea that that we don't want people is very new. And yet, if you talk to people now, it sort of seems like it's always been like that, and that's the right way. It's not.
Right. You, in part of your book, you specifically talked about Duluth and the Great Lake region. Could you share some of the things you wrote about in regards to both our city and this region of this country? Yeah.
Well, while I'm talking to you, Tone, this is a time when we are there is no place on Earth that isn't being hit by the climate crisis. There are huge floods currently underway, killing people right now in Central Europe. In the United States, there have been months of wildfire and extreme heat across central and western regions. There's been terrible flooding, storms. We've all been watching huge catastrophes unfold over the last few years, and places are becoming more unlivable. And we see that directly through the industries that have to be pragmatic and have to be honest about the extent of the situation. And that's the insurance industry, right? They are already pulling out of insuring properties, businesses, and so on in much of the state of Florida, in much of the state of California, and so on. It's becoming harder to resell your property there if it's in an at-risk place, and many places are. They're either in fire zones, places that weren't fire zones previously, but now that we're living in the post-climate change world, living in those places is a fire risk, because these fires are not just once in a century, they're happening regularly now.
Right.
Every few years. And so people, we're going to see this kind of apartheid situation where the wealthier can afford to move, and they will move to places like, the lakes, the Great Lakes. They will move to places like Duluth. They will move to former Rust Belt cities. And we are already seeing that movement happening. Now, the big tragedy is that those who cannot afford, the poorest people, will become increasingly trapped in houses that are uninsurable, unsellable, and they will not be able to afford to move. And that's a conversation we must all be having. How do we make it possible for people to move to safety within the United States, across state borders, as well as across, federal borders? How are we going to make this work?
Right. Yeah, I appreciate your comments. I have sisters in North Carolina and Florida in the U.S., and they've lost their homeowners insurance. So they're struggling to find new insurance coverage. And we're already beginning to see evidence of climate migration here in Duluth. I think in the past year, I've met individuals and families like from the states of Texas, California, and Florida who have moved here. So we're starting to see evidence of that.
Yeah, and it's not just the movement of individual families and individuals. We're talking about a much broader climate migration here. We're talking about the movement of capital, of industry, of agriculture, of expertise and skills. All of that is starting to move to these places, and really, it means that people, the mayor of Duluth, the governing bodies need to start thinking strategically, planning ahead for an increased population in those areas, just as the governance structures of places that are more at risk need to think about, managed retreat, need to think about helping mobilize people away from danger. So, this is a huge upheaval. The types of industry that will move in there, the types of denser housing, how is the because you still have to plan for climate extremes. I mean, if you look at the Great Lakes, their water volume has changed, pollution levels have changed, all of that over the past decades. They will still be hit by the climate crisis. It's just that the impacts will be lesser compared to other more hit places. New Orleans, is that even going to survive to 2040, let alone
Right.
2060? And where is the population going to move to? Well, increasingly it is going to move to these safer places.
Right. Over the past 4 or 5 years, we've begun to talk about climate change, even at a higher level in this region. And there has been some resistance to talking about climate migration. And I was wondering, given your experience and your research, have you seen examples of where cities or towns have been able to proactively talk about climate migration and make some positive changes?
Yeah, it is a difficult topic. It's very emotive as well, because we're talking about people, moving, shifting identity, shifting nationality. We're talking about these very big ideas of what does it mean to be a citizen. And it is frightening, the idea that, we will experience conditions so extreme that life becomes unlivable in those places. But there are places that are, first of all, forced to take it seriously. So small island states, for example, have already made agreements with other nations to, for example, Micronesia. Some of those states have made agreements with Australia and New Zealand to move gradually their populations over. We're seeing places like Fiji making similar agreements. We're seeing entire cities moving. The capital of Indonesia, the largest Muslim nation on earth, is moving from Jakarta, which is now becoming very unlivable. I mean, the flooding that they experienced there and the extreme storms are just economically and damaging, but also the health implications, sewerage, all of that. They're building a completely new city, new capital on an entirely different island. Places are having to take this much more seriously. Now there are cities that will disappear. Shanghai is looking increasingly shaky. Parts of New York City, we talked about New Orleans earlier. Miami. These are places which are already struggling with the extreme conditions we're facing in 2024. So if you look ahead, looking at the climate models of what is expected in terms of flood levels, incursion of seawater into the ground, into the water table, which affects agriculture, which affects sewerage, all of those sorts of things. Coastal erosion, huge problem. You look at the storms, the drought levels, making agricultural economies very, very hard in many areas, and the wildfires, which can zip through areas, knocking out power lines, causing power outages that are economically problematic, but also, a huge health hazard, right? Not just from breathing in the smoke, but also the fact that you can't use your air conditioning because there's a power outage. I mean, these are the sorts of things that we have to start talking about and we have to start planning for, and they affect the day-to-day life of billions of people.
Right. Yeah, you're right. In fact, just here in Duluth, although we present ourselves as kind of a climate haven, the last years we've been experiencing more air quality alerts because of the wildfires in Canada. And we're learning more about Lake Superior, which is a phenomenal freshwater lake. But now we're talking about the lake becoming warmer and the growth of algae blooms and microplastics in Lake Superior. So even here we're facing various issues.
The planet essentially is shrinking in the face of our, the activities of this dominant species, humanity. We are throwing things away that then appear as microplastics within the seafood that we eat. That loop is getting smaller and smaller. We can't just throw things away and hope that nature deals with it, whether it's air pollution or water pollution or soil pollution. We're living in this one environment, and we need a total change of mindset as to how we relate to the natural environment, and that includes the climate. It includes the air that we breathe. We can adapt to a certain extent, and we do, and we will. But ultimately, when conditions become too extreme, we've seen the power of mighty waves and tsunamis, of, terrible landslides and the wash of floods. I mean, we can't adapt to these conditions.
Right.
And we have to remember that there is a huge inequity involved here, not just between rich and poor countries, but within nations as well. In New York, when it gets flooded, it's and in New Orleans, it's the poorest Black people living in the basement apartments that get, they're the ones that drown, and they're the ones that lose their, all of their belongings, everything. The wealthy people can afford that climate protection to a certain degree. And so that's why we need to collectively act on this and ensure that it isn't just, a few tech billionaires funding their own private, climate security, but it really is something that that we realize that this is just one planet, and nobody has any more right to the safe places on it than anyone else, and we need to we need to sort that out, because there is plenty of room for everyone in the safer places. And there are huge economic benefits. You know, Duluth will grow economically. It will become much more important as a city. It will become a place where people go for their vacation, rather than more dangerous or too hot, sticky, awful places further south, right? So there is a lot of opportunity for these luckier places, if they plan properly, and if they make sure that, you know, they adapt to the new climate realities.
Right. I really appreciate your comments about our vulnerable populations. Here in Duluth, we received a report, I think it was around 2018. It was a climate assessment report, and it specifically talked about the impacts of climate change on our vulnerable populations here in Duluth and northern Minnesota. So I appreciate you sharing those comments. Yeah, where did your interest in the environment or climate change begin?
Oh, so I started off as a scientist, and I've always been really interested in the natural world. I'm a diver, scuba diver. I'm a tree climber, and I was at some point a rock climber. I love the multiple different environments, terrain, ecosystems of our planet. I think it's fascinating, but I'm also really interested in us, in humans, in how we adapt to these different environments with our incredible diversity of culture, and you know, whether that's different language or different types of clothing, or different types of canoe or kayak or whatever. You know, I think it's fascinating. And right now we're going through this incredible, extraordinary time where we're leaving the natural cycles of geological epochs. You know, we should be in the Holocene. We should be on our way towards another ice age, but we have become such a dominant species that we've switched that up, and now we are the dominating species. We are living in the Anthropocene. We're living in a time where, you know, humans control everything from the temperature of the atmosphere to the acidity of the oceans to whether a species goes extinct or survives. We've created all these artificial landscapes of, you know, cities or farmlands and all of this. And I think it's fascinating. I think it's really interesting. But I'm also conscious that it's a very perilous time, especially for people who have, you know, less power and less of a voice. And too much of the time we allow voice to be given to people who, for their own interest, deny the basic scientific facts that you know, they essentially lie about the state that we're in. And the losers in that case are the poorest, are the people that are most powerless. And, you know, I think it's a responsibility for all of us to speak up to that truth and be honest about the state we're in and the choices that we still have, because we have so many choices still.
Right. I appreciate that. Through the last 4 years when I interviewed people, and I know that the work we do, whether we're doing research or writing about or advocating for climate change issues, it can be very challenging. So I was very interested in asking you, what or who inspires or motivates you in the work that you do?
Oh, I guess I'm inspired by people who try to make a difference, you know, whether that's through incredible acts of creativity, you know, artists and musicians, or whether it's, you know, scientists and people who have ingeniously worked out how we can put various pieces of technology together to make our lives easier. And people who just, you know, thanklessly go out and help people. Not enough attention is given to these very quiet, ordinary people who run community centres, who, you know, provide food at food banks, who, you know, visit elderly in care homes, who pick up litter on beaches and on streets. And these are the people that make the lives of all of us so much better. And they're quite often thankless. But they inspire me, you know.
Okay, cool. And since our audience is Duluth and northern Minnesota, what would be a message or thoughts, reflections you would have for those of us in this region of the world as we approach not only climate change, but climate migration?
I think it's really important to think ahead as things become harder for all of us, as the climate becomes more extreme and more difficult, and people face more hardship because they're older, people are living a lot longer with multiple morbidities, things like dementia or physical disabilities, which mean they need much more care for much longer. And think about who is going to be providing that care. You know, who is going to be paying the taxes? Who is going to be making the industry? They are the new citizens, some of which are who are already living in Duluth, and some of whom are yet to arrive. And, you know, for Duluth to become a thriving, livable city that's green and clean and full of opportunity and hope, it means we must invest now in integrating and welcoming new citizens and making them feel part of the society as it grows.
Yeah, wow. Are you working on any current projects? Or yeah, what's going on now in your life?
Well, I'm still looking at this sort of issue, but also I'm concentrating on the energy transition, which is really exciting as well, and which will change all our lives.
Wow. Okay. Well, I really appreciate you joining us today, and I'm definitely going to be encouraging a lot of people to pick up your book, and hopefully we can have some very constructive conversations in the days and weeks ahead in regards to how climate migration could impact Duluth and how we can respond and address it in a very positive, empowering way. But thank you very much for joining us. Look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you, Tone. Thanks very much. So my book's called Nomad Century, How to Survive the Climate Upheaval. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure.